My name is Amanda. I'm a junior social work major, and I use she, her, hers pronouns. Our sociology class, Social Problems Analysis, has done a semester-long class-wide research project on the topics of racial repression and inequality, and we are here today to present to you our research and analysis. To set the stage, we're going to start off with some contemporary forms of racial repression and inequality that many of you may have already heard of. And at the end, we will save time for a Q&A discussion, so if any questions come up during the presentation, please make a mental note of those, and we'll be happy to answer them at the end. And now I'm going to turn it over to Claire.
Hello everyone, my name is Claire. I'm a double major here at Augsburg in Communications and Sociology. I'm a sophomore and I use she, her, hers pronouns. So to kind of start things off, we thought that it would be beneficial to highlight some instances of racial oppression that we see in the news today. And so the first thing that I want to talk about is the Fair Sentencing Act that was passed by President Obama in 2010. This was put into place to address the racial disparities that we see for the length of prison sentences for crack versus cocaine users. Crack being seen as a drug for black people, whereas cocaine is seen as this glamorous white person's drug, despite the fact that it is not drugs plural, but rather a drug is the same thing. And so this is problematic for two reasons. The first reason why this act is a problem is because it only applies at a federal level. So the reason why this is a problem is because the majority of crack cocaine-related drug charges are prosecuted by the state, and so these racial disparities that it was intended to address still exist. Secondly, it doesn't look at the disproportionate amount of law enforcement present within low-income neighborhoods, which are typically communities and neighborhoods of color. This kind of segues into the next topic, which is the militarization of police forces. Because of the heavy amount of law enforcement that we see present in the neighborhoods that I just described, if we look at the majority of the population for those incarcerated, we can see that the majority are people of color, specifically African Americans. And so what ends up happening is when these people leave the prison system, they're unable to vote, maybe because they're on parole, which leads to an underrepresentation of an already oppressed group within society. Also, there's unequal access to the workforce and jobs, which was present before they went into the prison system and is kind of amplified when they leave. In the past, these marginalized groups of people have come together to combat these oppressive techniques being thrust upon them, oftentimes in the form of social movements. And so one social movement that we see highlighted in the news today is Black Lives Matter. And I want to point out that Black Lives Matter does not contribute to racial oppression and inequality, rather it tries to achieve the opposite. However, the way that it's represented and portrayed in the media does contribute to racial oppression. So our class wanted to dig deeper into the way that these marginalized groups of people experience racial oppression and inequality. And so in order to do this, we conducted an intensive theory and literature review. This was followed by the big picture, so looking at racial oppression and inequality at a structural level, and this was done through reviewing statistical data. After this, we looked at institutional occurrences of racial oppression and inequality, and we specifically focused on the institution of higher education with an emphasis on Augsburg College. And then last, we looked at how an individual experiences racial oppression or inequality. And in order to do this, we conducted a series of one-on-one interviews on people's perceptions and or experiences of racial oppression and inequality. And now I'm going to turn it over to Miles.
Hi, I'm Miles Hamberlin. I'm a junior here at Augsburg. I'm a sociology major, and I was put in charge of the thesis statement. So what we came up with was racial oppression manifests itself within multiple levels of society. In order to work against this, individuals must be conscious of the interconnectedness of racial oppression and inequality present within every facet of society. And if there's an institution where racism exists, it's always perpetuated by the others. To ignore this is to turn your back on racial oppression and those marginalized groups that have to endure it. Now I'm going to pass it on to the literary theory group. Thank you.
So we focused on the theory and the review portion of the project. My name is Hannah. I am a junior sociology and religion double major.
And I go by she, her, hers pronouns.
My name is Drusella Davis. I also go by Boya. I am a sociologist major along with playwriting, and I use she, her pronouns.
Hi everyone, I'm Cole. I use Z here and Z zero interchangeably for my pronouns, and I'm a gender, sex, and women's studies major here at Augsburg, and this is my last semester.
For this segment of the presentation, if you all want to look in your handouts, there appear to be extras, so if there aren't some on your seats, you can just grab them from around you. So throughout the course of the semester, we used 5 different texts, all highlighting different marginalized groups in American society today. And through these texts, our group's goal was to sift out different concepts and terms that would kind of highlight the racial oppression that different groups feel. And then using all of those blanket terms that we had, we tried to distill that into a few. So they did 5 books. So the context of the review that we are doing for the literature analysis looks at colonialism in the past and neocolonialism in the present. And through this, there are social and societal, institutional consequences that people feel on a daily basis. These consequences manifest themselves in an interpersonal level and at the institutional level, so we'll go over those really quickly, starting with institutional.
Okay, so a lot of our books that we looked at in class focused on the racial consequences we face in our society. So in our society, we have a social hierarchy where there are people at the top and then people at the bottom. The top 1% consists of a majority of white males, and one person from that group makes the same amount of money as everyone from the bottom 30%. Some of the consequences that we face because of this include stratification, which is a system of layers, classes, and categories, which is what I talked about, the whole idea of the social ladder and the social hierarchy. Success frame, where there are differing standards for each race. Erasure, which is to remove a history and record of a people. This happens most in education. Controlling images, usually perpetuated by the media. This is where false images are perpetuated and are widely understood as truth. So therefore, yeah, so people believe them even though these images may be false.
And then due to the structural, the institutional structures that are in place, there are also interpersonal manifestations of racial inequality and oppression. So we've got a few up here. Again, I wanted to reiterate that these are just like a few of the umbrella terms that we pulled out of these books. There's like lots of things underneath them. So one of the things that we highlighted was objectification, and this is an umbrella term for things that happen when people of color are pigeonholed and then like basically made as objects or as tools or as tokenized groups. So this includes tokenization, like I said, hypersexualization, things like cultural appropriation fit under this. And then when people in those groups get objectified, they begin to internalize those narratives and internalize those, like Oya was saying earlier, those controlled images. And so an example of internalization that I thought of for myself is that when I was growing up, I went through our education systems, which taught a mostly like white-dominated and white-centered history, and didn't talk about Asian people in a deep and meaningful way. And so as a result of only being taught about white histories for so long, I never believed that, you know, Asian people had rich and deep histories and didn't have like rich and deep contributions to American history either. And so as a result of this kind of internalization that people begin to experience, they develop a double consciousness, which a double consciousness is a theory that was created by W.B. Du Bois, who is up here in this image. And double consciousness is basically when people who live in with these internalized ideas of themselves and people like them have to create different egos, different consciousnesses to both celebrate like the cultures that they come from and to survive in the culture, in the dominant culture that they live in. So this can be things like straddling cultures, like straddling an American culture and a Mexican culture, or even like literally speaking two different languages or multiple different languages and having to code switch, where people have to use a different language that they may not be comfortable with for the sake of survival in different situations.
All right, so again, using this context as a framework for the rest of our presentation, if you will all look at the definition portion of your handout, there are a couple more words and definitions that we thought were important that might come up throughout the presentation or that we didn't have enough time, unfortunately, to bring up. So if you want to just kind of read through those. And what we really wanted to show is that while these books may have been centered in more historical context for different marginalized groups, it has a very real impact on what people are feeling today and how people experience daily life. So going back to what Claire was talking about with Black Lives Matter and militarized police forces, this has been happening in U.S. history since the beginning of the United States. And we really kind of learned about this throughout the context of different marginalized groups. So American Indians and being forced to leave lands, police militarization. Today, police brutality again manifests itself through African American youth and how they are mistreated and targeted and profiled. Immigration has tons of negative connotations in a modern context that only focuses on certain skin types or language barriers. And political representation manifests itself in that some people just don't have a voice in politics. And you can see that on a daily basis, especially in the midst of all the political happenings that occur today. Next, we will pass it over to the macro and meso levels of analysis, so the societal and the institutional or organizational levels.
Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Tyler. I am a political science major, sociology minor, and I'm a senior, so I got about a week left of college.
My name is Miranda Rasmussen. I'm a communication studies major, and I use she, her, hers pronouns.
I'm Alex Schluck. I'm a junior. I'm a con major, and I use him, his, and he pronouns.
So we're going to start with macro and meso level data analysis. Macro, like Hannah said, societal, looking at the bigger picture. First, looking at racial inequality and how it manifests itself in income inequality and then also in law enforcement. And then Tyler's going to touch on meso, which is institutional, specifically at Augsburg, and a bit narrower as well. So income inequality is extremely prevalent in America today and has become a very hot topic, as we all know. It's especially worse in marginalized groups of people. So this graph shows the disparities showing Forbes top 400, which are predominantly like white males, as Teresa had touched on, in comparison to 16 million Black American households. So that shows a really huge gap between the two of those. The next graph is going to be the median net worth of American families, which shows kind of a similar disparity in wealth. The white families having obviously a much larger portion and much more opportunities, much more net worth than non-white families. And then the next graph is going to show percentage of poverty line in marginalized communities as well. Poverty rates have been especially telling, and as you can see, there are 17.8% more Blacks in poverty in America than there are whites, which is very troubling. So this graph represents the differences in rates in homicide victims. As a matter of fact, Black people are at 3 times higher risk dying at the hands of police, which isn't shown by the graph, but it's just kind of a consistent fact as we're seeing as more, they're seen as more threatening, and so this graph shows that piece of information pretty accurately.
So I'm talking about the sociological context. high-stakes testing, SAT, ACT, and the LSAT. Many different cultures don't have educational advantages that wealth can bring to these tests. Many white privileged students have two parents that went to college, so they have a college degree, both parents that can afford to take these tests, and also with that have private lessons and classes to get their child the best grades that they can possible. And standardized testing contains class element. Many immigrants don't speak English as their first language at home, so it makes it difficult for the teachers and other students for them to have an advantage in school. This can lead to school setback and academic failure in the long run. And the best predictor of test score in the students is the zip code of father's occupation. Environment, upbringing, and parents have shown to have an effect on a child's education level. In areas, in different schools, like urban and rural schools, there's a difference. There's lack of education, lack of resources, not as many teachers or counselors to go to, and with that, the zip code and a father's occupation can make a difference with that. And moving on to my graph, you can see the Native American and Hispanic IQ scores on the ACT, SAT scores compared to white students' IQ on these ACT and SAT scores.
All right, so we've looked at racial oppression at a society level. Now we're going to take a little narrower look. We're going to look at higher education as an institution. Specifically, we're going to work towards looking at Augsburg and assessing the strengths and weaknesses of Augsburg in terms of race and diversity here. So if you guys refer to your handout, you'll see this graph. It's titled Number of Percentage of Persons aged 25 to 29 with at least a bachelor's degree. And I'd like to refer you to this part. So it gives demographics of how many people belong to that race of the total population, and it gives the percent that have a bachelor's degree. You'll see that only African Americans, Hispanics have half of that of whites, and also Native Americans, they have the lowest. And then another interesting thing to look at this graph is if you look at Asian Americans, you'll see that nearly 60% of the people in this demographic have a bachelor's degree. This is an example of the Asian American achievement paradox. And this is basically an example of the model minority. And the model minority is a tool of oppression in American society. It serves to serve an ideological function that demonstrates that the American dream is possible if you work hard. And then they point to the model minority and say, see, like they're doing it. But in reality, there's a lot of things in place in society that prevents that from happening. So this graph depicts how the Asian American achievement paradox is present, and also how people who are African American, Hispanic American, and Native American have a hard time achieving a bachelor's degree. This graph is a pie chart that depicts the dispersion of scholarships based on ethnicity, and you can see that a far majority are of white ethnicity. And based on the graphs that Miranda is showing, we know that the minorities have a far larger percentage of the population below the poverty line. So this is showing us that the scholarships are not being given based off of need. So that's another example of inequality that we see in higher education. So now we're going to look at Augsburg specifically. As many of you have heard dozens of times, the organizational mission of Augsburg is to create informed citizens, thoughtful stewards, critical thinkers, responsible leaders, and people committed to international diversity. Augsburg is a liberal arts college, and so it's defined by excellence in the liberal arts and professional studies, and it's grounded in the faith and values of the Lutheran Church. And then also it's shaped by the urban environment in which it's founded. So population that's served, there's about 2,620 undergraduate students here, and about 500 graduate students. And of those students, about 40% are people of color.
So now we're going to talk about the strengths of Augsburg College when it comes to diversity and inclusion. According to the 2015 Augsburg Inclusion Executive Summary, 89% of Augsburg students feel welcomed and supported by their faculty, and 85% of students feel welcomed and supported by other students. Departments and services are also a strength of Augsburg, such as multicultural services, trio student support services, and campus activities, as well as like orientations. And another thing is that students feel Augsburg is working hard to create an inclusive campus environment for people who aren't feeling included.
So some weaknesses or things that we see Augsburg needs to work on. One thing is amongst the faculty, professors, and administrative people at school, there's not a lot of diversity. So one thing we'd say is having more diversity with people in authority positions here. Another thing is many students feel as though they're the only person representing their race in class, which is very discouraging because 40% of our student body are people of color. So that's another issue that we see. Another issue is alumni donations and boosters. The demographics of the college has changed dramatically over the last 40 years. And so a lot of issues that people who are boosters see as a college isn't the same as the needs that we really have at the college based on racial oppression. And so making efforts to educate boosters on things that would make the college more inclusive, and that'd be something that we could work on. And then another thing that was mentioned by Cole is there's overrepresentation of Anglo-American or white histories and literature in our classes. And a lot of students would like there to be a more diverse, multicultural approach to the readings that we have when we study in class.
So now we're going to make some suggestions for courses of actions for Augsburg. As a class, we did a panel with Augsburg faculty, student leaders from groups like SRJ and student government, as well as administration. So some of the things that we suggest are, first off, making an intentional racial focus in the new building that's being built on campus, as well as adding racial focus to buildings that are already on campus, as well as more intentional hiring of staff of color, just like Tyler was talking about, something that some staff and administration that are more representative of the 40% of colored students on campus, as well as intercultural awareness implemented in class, which used to be a mandatory class at Augsburg, but was taken away under the premise that teachers would all implement it in their classes, which apparently hasn't been happening as much as it should have. Also, prayer spaces and meditation rooms that are more inclusive to other religions, not just Christianity. And last but not least, finding a way to make the alumni donors who aren't aware of need on campus a little bit more aware of where the money should be allocated.
And lastly, before we hand it over to the next group, we would like to make some suggestions to society as a whole that we see. Or just in terms of higher education. So the first thing we want to discuss is standardized testing and funding for schools. So as a lot of you know, funding for schools is based off of their performance on tests. And we see a lot of problems with that because the schools that are struggling don't get the funding that the schools that are doing well. And obviously the schools that are struggling are the ones that need more funding so they can help those students. So that's one thing we would suggest is to reinforce or look at that policy and try to change that. The next thing we're looking at is entrance exams. Right now, it's hard for students to do well on those because you have to pay to go to the practice test, you have to pay for tutors. So having schools make it more accessible, prepare for those tests, because it's crucial to do well on those to get into college. And the last thing is, as in the pie chart that I showed, scholarships are not fairly distributed, and also they're not distributed based on need. So looking at the process of who gets scholarships is not something we'd like to reassess. And then, so now we're going to turn over to the next group, and they'll be looking at more individual experiences at Augsburg, talking about the interviews we conducted. So I'm going to turn over to Marco, Mark, Michael, and Emily.
Hi everybody, my name is Mark Daniels. I am a junior here at Augsburg College. I am studying sociology and religion, and I use he, him, his pronouns.
Hi everybody, I'm Marco Mansfield. I'm a junior here at Augsburg College. I'm studying sociology with a minor in psychology, and I use he, him, his pronouns.
My name is Emily Campbell, and I'm also a junior studying sociology, and I use she, her, hers pronouns.
My name is Michael Sell. I am a sociology major and a theater and performing arts minor, and I use he, his, him pronouns.
So for our portion of the presentation, we looked at individual experiences dealing with racism, racial oppression, and societal institutions. In order to do this, the class conducted 34 interviews of people between the ages of 18 and 30 from a vast array of different cultural and ethnic backgrounds. If you look at your handouts, you'll see a demographic breakdown of all the people who we interviewed during this process. During our presentation, we have several quotes on screens. The names of the people in the quotes have been changed to protect their identity, but the races that are listed are what they self-identified as. So the first question we really asked during our interview process was for the interviewees to decide and really look at what does racial oppression mean to them, what does racism mean to them. And we asked them all to give their own definition. We got a vast array of experiences and ideas that came from this. The two main points being color and power. And as Taylor points out really well here, It's all about power. Racism made race. And that was a common theme we saw come up again and again. Once they defined racism for themselves, we asked them to then start looking at some of their personal experiences dealing with racism.
So while we were conducting these interviews, a common theme that we came across was profiling of people of color that manifests itself in the form of stereotypes and microaggressions. The result, as you can see in this quote by Craig here, is the intent of creating the societal insecurities with black people and many other people of color. On the next slide, we see that a lot of conversation we analyzed as a group backed up this notion of profiling from the opposite end of the racial hierarchy. As Jim, a white individual, divulges in this quote, I get cautious when I see someone of a different race than me walking down the street looking like a thug. This quote really speaks volumes to the type of profiling that can occur.
So kind of going off what Michael says, I'm going to be talking about family mistreatment by law enforcement. And after reviewing the many interview transcriptions that our class produced throughout the semester, we decided upon using this quote from Craig, because it truly, who identifies as African American, because it truly captures the way that a young person conceptualizes the idea of law enforcement and what authority means. It's also a clear representation of how the idea of mistreatment by law enforcement can manifest itself within you at a very young age. So this quote is Craig remembering when he was, I think it was 7 or 8. His stepfather at the time biked home at night, and upon coming home, Craig saw that his stepfather had a black eye and a bloody nose. It wasn't until later that night that his parents had told him that his stepfather had gotten pulled over by the cops because he didn't have a light on his bike, and they actually had beat him pretty badly because of that.
A third theme that many people identified was lack of representation in institutions. So Tyler discussed that earlier in professors and administration and higher education, and Rick discusses it here with police officers, that many are white. And this happens in every institution we ask people to discuss, in government, in media, in education. Virtually any of the institutions that you'll see listed on your handout, people discuss lack of representation. And this both demonstrates demonstrates racism by showing how people have been kept out of these positions of power and continues to perpetuate racism in and of itself.
A fourth thing that came up during the interviews was how white people perceive racism, and it broke down primarily into 2 categories. The first being individuals who just didn't experience it, didn't really understand it, couldn't relate to it, and had some trouble with it, and discussed that in their interviews. And the second, as Jasper highlights here, was people who realized that they had a position of privilege within society, that white privilege existed for them, and who took a real purposeful action to walk between the lines of that and to try to live their lives so as not to impede or let their privilege interact too much or supersede the lack of privilege that others have.
In our interviews, we gave people a non-exhaustive list of institutions in U.S. society and asked them to rank the top 3 that they thought contribute to racial oppression. And in doing this, we found that people most often ranked law enforcement as number 1, and a tie in second place was media and education. And you can see on your handout a list of all of the institutions ranked. And because law enforcement was the most frequently identified, that's what we'll be spending the majority of our time discussing.
So kind of going off what Mark was saying about privilege, this quote is from a white individual and how they view law enforcement. It's a great example of how law enforcement tends to operate in an oppressive manner by profiling certain racial groups. Our interviewee, Jasper, he's saying how he doesn't fear the police even while engaging in unlawful activities. If you can read this quote, you can see that Jasper, has driven around Minneapolis multiple times smoking marijuana, yet he's not afraid of being pulled over by the cops or harassed or anything like that. On the other hand, Rick remembers a conversation that he had with his parents when he had gotten pulled over. He said that he was abiding by the rules of the road and that he wasn't speeding at all. And his parents actually responded, well, you could have just gotten pulled over because you're a black kid driving a nice car. Now, I don't know if many of you have experienced this, but I've actually experienced this personally on a first-hand basis. And I was actually really shocked when the police officer pulled me over. He had asked me if the vehicle that I was driving was mine, and he actually made me sit on the side of the curb while he searched the vehicle for unknown reasons. So this goes to show how police officers have a stereotypical view, perception of minorities in a discriminatory way, despite despite your privileged background. Sorry.
Speaking still about law enforcement, since it was the #1 institution that our interviewees actually labeled as the #1 institution contributing racial oppression, a common theme we noticed was by interviewees of color was the distrust of law enforcement, even from a young age. As Craig points out in this quote, you grew up kind of suspicious and skeptical in the face of authority figures, meaning police officers. Moving on with this quote by Taylor, another identified multiracial individual, that the skepticism can have consequences. To me, that's a life or death situation. The media coverage of police violence of people of color fuels this fire for the distrust of law enforcement, even if you yourself have never experienced it within law enforcement. Rick, a 21-year-old identified African American, thought of how he would never have to be afraid of a cop, but the cruel truth is it's the reality of our society, and something that people of color must worry about as well as teach their children about.
So another thing we discussed with people during the interviews is why racism continues to exist within the institution of law enforcement. And the biggest theme that came up was that it's a broken system. As Jacob points out here, law enforcement was developed as a white system. Even if officers aren't overtly racist, they still participate within a racist system. This came across with a lot of interviewees talking about how in minority neighborhoods, white police officers tend to be the majority of the people they interact with and who are overseeing these neighborhoods, which creates a divide when one group can't relate to or have a commonality with another. Another idea that came up over and over again, which relates to what Claire was saying earlier, and the ideas of police becoming militarized, is that they walk around with a lot of power and a lot of authority and very little regulation. A lot of the interviewees felt that people in law enforcement didn't have the same amount of oversight that they should for the amount of power which they carried in society.
While people identified law enforcement as the #1 institution, media and education were also frequently discussed. So here, Gabby discusses microaggressions that she faced in school as English was her second language. People throughout our interviews discussed a variety of microaggressions that impeded on their education throughout their K-12 experience. Najma also discusses a larger system failure in the education system. She says that she gave up on school because they gave up on me. And that just shows that a lot of teachers were not investing in them, and it made it very difficult for students of color to succeed in K-12 schools. Tino offers a suggestion for how schools can actually be used to combat racism, saying that instead of learning about racism when you get to college, you should be learning about it sooner, and learning about your role in racism and ending racism. In discussing media, Ellen talks about how media shapes our perception of race. So when you see a whitewashed TV shows and books and news reports, that makes society seem much more whitewashed than it actually is, and makes that reality, as Cole and Drusella were discussing earlier. And when you see racial tropes and stereotypes on TV, that comes to present how you view the race in reality as well. Gabby also discusses this, saying that the media is a catalyst to racism, so what you see in the media normalizes racism in society and adds to racism in society as a whole. And Najma discusses the oppression she faced in the media as a black woman because of lack of representation and because of the perpetuation of Eurocentric beauty standards and how that was internalized in ways that Cole had discussed earlier in the presentation.
The last thing we asked interviewees was, what are possible solutions? They've identified racism and racial institutions. What were their thoughts on how we can fix it within society? And there was 3 key points that came up across many of the interviews. Number 1 is that the responsibility falls on everyone. Each person has to look at themselves and figure out how best to acknowledge it and work with it within their lives. The second idea that came up was that it can't be done by a government group, it can't be done by a group of individuals or even a single individual. It takes each and every person within society to recognize where racism is and to work towards fixing it. And the last part that came up was that we needed opportunity, equality, and equity for everyone. As Linda points out here, if a kid drops out of school, if the achievement gap is too big, then do something about it. We don't need to just recognize racism when we encounter it in our lives. We need to also take steps then to correct it, to fix it, and to try and make it better for those who don't have privilege.
So then this quote is actually from Ellen, who's talking about how law enforcement truly lacks the proper training and education that officers need in order to equally protect and serve all minority groups. After going through the many interview transcriptions, for possible solutions and how to change law enforcement. Suggestions were that police officers be required to pass the bar so that they have a more familiar, or so that they're more familiarized with the legal system, as well as they must prove themselves worthy of dealing with situations where they will encounter people who don't identify as the same race as the officer.
And while we've been talking about these institutions as if they operate on their own, we'd like to highlight that they're not isolated, that media and government and law enforcement and education all function as one system within society. And so while we did have the privilege of interviewing Audrey Lord, we did choose a quote from her. And she says, "There's no such thing as a single issue struggle because we do not live single issue lives." So with that, we're going to turn it over to Miles, who will continue to discuss these interrelating layers of oppression.
All right, so I was in charge of obviously talking about the interrelating levels. And kind of going off what Emily said, well, the quote she had about how everything was interconnected, it's important when trying to analyze these levels of, these analytical levels, to see how they kind of impact one another. Obviously, the individual, this is institutional, like the meso level or like middle level, and then there's the society, or societal level, more like your macro level. All of these, they share some common ground with one another, and that's just how they impact each other. Right here, this is a zone kind of where the individuals that make up society come and try to, discuss their opinions and activities on policy. That is then the macro level passes down. All right, so looking at this level, at this diagram, you can see by this arrow there's kind of a push and pull between each level. So up there at the top, the societal or macro level will kind of make policies, which is passed down to the institutional level where they're in charge of carrying out the policies made by the, in this case, it would be the government. Now, for this institutional level, it could be whether it's education, media, or law enforcement, prison system. It could be any of those. Just for this case, let's use education. Now, say the top level, the macro level, passes down policies about, let's make sure we have kind of a white curriculum that we teach in school. Well, then that, obviously, they're going to teach that, and then the individuals, how they interact with that, there's going to be a reaction from that that's going to be passed up to the people educating. And from there, that's going to be told by the policymakers, who are then going to reform the policies or whatever. But say there are the test scores, the standardized test. If you're an individual that doesn't do well with that, or your classroom isn't getting represented correctly according to your race, you're going to not be likely to give positive feedback, or you're going to fight against it. So then, instead of actually getting the help that the individuals need on the meso level, they are likely to resist it. And then from the meso level, that goes up to the macro level, and they see that, well, who are we going to give our funding to if these people aren't participating in it? So that kind of perpetuates it as well. And as I was saying, this could be any institution. If you're not participating in education and you don't see the teachers that represent your race, you're more likely to drop out of education. And there's a thing called the high school to prison pipeline, which talks about how people of color are more likely to drop out of high school and then be put into the prison system. And that kind of shows how the interconnectedness of these institutions made by the policies of government can be unfair. To that, I'm going to hand it off to Amanda.
So our class has learned a lot on the experiences of racial oppression and inequality throughout the course of the semester, through everything that has been mentioned during this presentation, including the several books we read macro-level research and analysis, including current events, meso-level research and analysis, specifically on the institutional level here at Augsburg, and micro-level research and analysis through our individually conducted interviews and how all of these levels interrelate. In conclusion, we would like to thank everybody who contributed to our research and presentation, including the participants from our individual interviews and the student, staff, and faculty who participated in our panel on campus. We would like to thank you all for attending and now open it up for a Q&A discussion.
Any questions?
Yes.
I was wondering, how did you go about sampling? Like, how did you figure out who to interview for this project?